So when we look at intimate partner abuse across different nations and cultures and that sort of thing, do we see big differences?
Great question. We don't see big differences right now we did the study in 7 English-speaking countries, but again, it's mostly England, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, all these countries. We don't see many differences. There were a lot of similarity, especially in relation to male victims of domestic violence. When we look at some studies that did comparative research in Europe, and there were studies that compared experiences between both men and women in 6 largest cities in Europe, in 6 different countries. They don't see many differences in the rates of violence. So again, we look at the rates of violence. It's harder to look specifically risk types of abuse experienced by them, but again, not big differences if you take European countries. I'm glad to see right now there are some studies coming from some other countries, and I'm seeing, for example, studies from Africa, especially in relation to male victims. They're showing some interesting forms of abuse, attack with machete, or something very specific for the cultural context. We still don't see very good population-based studies. It mostly come from smaller samples. Again, I know the very interesting country right now I'm looking at is Japan. A lot of secrecy. Domestic violence is very much hidden, and people do not talk about this much. But I know there are some studies that the government of Japan is doing, so we're looking into those rates of violence there. So again, what I would say I'm a part of the big international dating violence study where there were 32 countries. This is where we see big difference in the rates of violence, starting with as low as about 10, 15 in Scandinavian countries, going up to about 70 in Iran, Afghanistan, in some other countries. So we do see a huge range in relation to victimization of men and women. And we do see similar differences in the very big range in World Health Organization studies, but it's only for violence against women. They publish studies regularly when they also have about 30 countries. And when they look at violence against women, it's mostly in relationship and family context. We see a big range starting from, again, in about 10% in some European countries and going to 50, 60, and 70% in some countries like Rwanda. It's a lot of violence there. So so we do see in the world there is a big range in prevalence rates of violence against men, both violence against men and women, types of victimizations, and how the societies treat domestic violence. In some countries is just not it's not a big deal. It's not considered to be a serious issue. Like now in Russia, I wouldn't say we treated it more seriously several years before. Now it's not it's not something people really discuss that openly. So it's changing too, depending on the political situation. It's changing.
So across, when you're just looking across like the handful of English speaking nations, you don't see tremendous variability, but when you're looking globally, you do start to see a lot more variability.
Yep.
And these are mostly based on cultural norms, is how you make sense of it.
Yeah, this is how we make sense of it. Yeah, there were some examples that didn't make sense to me. For example, in Russia, the homicide rate is much higher than in some European countries, in Canada, for example, or even the United States. And of course, Europe, where homicide rate is very, very low. It's about between 1 and 2. And in Canada, it's 2 per 100,000. But in Russia, it used to be 20, 35. That was very high. But domestic violence rate, according to the service, was nearly similar. It was about 25%, like in the rest of the world. So to me, it was surprisingly how, because I would expect domestic violence rate would be correlating with homicide rate. So higher homicide rate, higher domestic violence rates. While it looks like it's the case in many countries, it may not be the case in some countries. So overall trend, yes, more violent societies, weaker rule of law, more gender inequality index is higher, then yes, we see more violence in intimate relationships overall, but it's not always a perfect correlation in some countries.